She was a crusader.
This, 22-year-old young woman with the wasp waist and waif-like appearance who not only survived it, but came out to write this harrowing tale and actually created change.
She also did things that I think even today we'd be really impressed with.
Nellie Bly, born Elizabeth Jane Cochran on May 5, 1864, was a journalist and author from Pennsylvania. She is widely known for her groundbreaking expose of a mental institution in New York, where she went undercover as a mentally ill woman named Nellie Brown. Bly's shocking report of the horrific conditions of the asylum set off a grand jury investigation of that particular institution and also resulted in a $1 million increase in New York City's budget for the care of the mentally insane.
In early American communities, family members cared for the mentally ill, but often the sick and poor unfortunately ended up in almshouses or jails.
A big part of that was fear. Fear of the unknown. There was a little bit of, let's protect them as well as us, because we don't know what they could do to harm us or harm themselves.
Mental illness was thought to be caused by a moral or spiritual failing, and the resulting stigma, shame, and punishment was hard on the mentally ill and their families. In 1752, the Quakers in Philadelphia opened the Pennsylvania Hospital, which provided for the care of a small number of mentally ill patients, with basement rooms complete with shackles attached to the walls. Later, in 1773, Virginia opened the Eastern State Hospital in Williamsburg, with 24 cells for patients, using restraints, strong drugs, plunge baths, shock water treatment, and an electrostatic machine. New York followed in 1792 and Kentucky in 1824. By 1890, every state had built one or more publicly supported mental hospital. While some just wanted the afflicted away from public view, others genuinely wanted these institutions to provide care for the mentally ill. Pennsylvanians funded a new and improved hospital in 1856, the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, with a code of rules and regulations detailing strict rules for patients and workers. For example, page 20 of the code said every part of the wards is to be kept scrupulously neat, clean, and well ventilated at all times. Page 24 stipulated that every patient will take a warm bath once a week. Honorable intentions aside, conditions in some asylums drastically deteriorated due to corruption and loss of virtuous motives. Nurses and doctors lowered standards of care for patients while keeping public and government funding for their own use. Marginalized groups, such as the poor, women, and immigrants, were often labeled insane and conveniently locked up in institutions, whether they were actually sane or not, literally out of sight and out of mind. This is where Nellie Bly entered the scene. By 1887, 19-year-old Nellie Bly was already quite well known for her work in investigative journalism. She had previously gone undercover in a sweatshop and a prison, written about the inequality between the sexes and corruption in major corporations, and had been threatened with jail by the Mexican government for her criticisms. Bly eventually traveled to New York, where she met and impressed Joseph Pulitzer, the publisher of The World. Familiar with Bly's work, Pulitzer asked her to do what she did best: go undercover for an article.
She started with The World doing a story about wanting to get into the insane asylums on Blackwell's Island. It was the home of all the cancer spots of modern Manhattan.
Bly agreed instantly, saying, "I always had a desire to know asylum life more thoroughly, a desire to be convinced that the most helpless of God's creatures, the insane, were cared for kindly and properly."
She wanted to go inside. She feigned insanity, checked into a boarding house, got herself committed, and stayed there for 10 days.
Before being examined by 4 expert doctors, she saw several women being convicted, despite being obviously sane and having clear and logical backstories. While being inspected, she noticed that the doctor wasn't actually paying attention to her, but was more interested in flirting with the nurse. Fooling everyone around her, Bly was eventually classified as positively demented, convicted as insane, and forced into the care of the doctors and nurses at the asylum.
This was incredibly brave, incredibly courageous, and in my belief, I think it's historic too.
Thus began Nellie Bly's 10 days of unimaginable horror. Her first terrifying experience took place right after she was admitted, when she was stripped and forced into a bath. The water was ice cold, and I again began to protest. My teeth chattered, and my limbs were goose-fleshed and blue with cold. Suddenly I got, one after the other, 3 buckets of water over my head, ice-cold water too, into my eyes, my ears, my nose, and my mouth. I think I experienced some of the sensations of a drowning person as they dragged me, gasping, shivering, and quaking from the tub. For once, I did look insane. Bly was then put, still soaking wet, into a short flannel slip and hurried into her room. The bed and sheets were incredibly thin and uncomfortable, instantly becoming damp and chilly from her wet body. Even if Bly was able to ignore the cold and discomfort, sleeping was impossible. Several times during the night, nurses would barge into her room, stomp around while talking loudly, and shove their flashlights in her face. In the morning, Bly was dragged out of bed and stripped of her clothes once again, this time changing into threadbare, dirty, ill-fitting clothing. Bly's hair, still matted and damp from last night, was pulled and jerked around by the nurses' combing. After a meager breakfast, the women were forced to scrub the entire building and clean everyone's clothes. Finally, after the cleaning was done, the patients were allowed a walk outside. However, several groups were actually tied together with ropes and belts. A distinctly awful practice that Bly mentions in great lengths was making the patients sit upright and still on hard concrete benches. Even if they moved a tiny bit or leaned to one side, they were severely reprimanded by the nurses. Bly commented, "I was never so tired as I grew sitting on those benches. What, excepting torture, could produce insanity quicker than this treatment?" With this quote, she stated that the asylum was actually creating the madness which it was supposed to be treating. After the walk was an awful dinner, and then the women were given their baths and sent to bed. This tiring and painful process was repeated for 9 days until Joseph Pulitzer sent Bly's lawyer, Peter A. Hendricks, to get her out of the asylum.
During Bly's stay at the asylum, the majority of her trouble stemmed from the violent and unprofessional nature of the nurses and a general lack of care from the administration. Nurses would torture the patients by dragging them into a closet, beating them, choking them for fun, and taking away clothing so they would freeze. They also attempted to drown the women in their baths if they kept trying to complain to doctors. If someone did get through to a doctor, he would just pass off their begging and pleading as part of their delusions. Even the superintendent ignored the conditions that the women were forced to live in. Everyone on the island, both employees and those in authority, were well aware of what was going on, but chose to ignore it and felt no moral or ethical obligation to stop it.
Soon after Nellie Bly left the island, the world ran her sensational expose in a series of articles. Bly was summoned to appear before the grand jury, where she took the witness stand. In front of 23 jurors, she described her entire story in great detail. After hearing her account, the jurors requested a trip together to the island so they could witness the horrors for themselves. Unfortunately, someone notified the asylum about the visit, so when the grand jury arrived at the island, everything was completely different. The halls were clean, beds and baths were replaced, and the nurses and doctors denied anything that Bly had stated. Thankfully, Miss Ann Neville, another patient, told the authorities that the nurses and doctors only started to be somewhat nice to the patients after Bly had left the asylum. This convinced the jurors that Bly had been telling the truth. Bly said, "I hardly expected the grand jury to sustain me, after they saw everything different from what it had been while I was there. Yet they did, and the report to the court advises all the changes made that I had proposed." The jury's report called for increased funds for care of the insane, prompting a $1 billion increase to the budget of the Department of Public Charities and Correction.
Her expose exposed some of the medical practitioners and their ability to adequately and accurately diagnose.
The grand jury also made sure that future examinations were more thorough so that only the seriously ill were committed to an asylum.
Nellie Bly's article became in such high demand that she published them as a book called 10 Days in a Madhouse. Her unprecedented expose had an immediate and powerful impact on mental institutions. Around the nation, mental health facilities were being spontaneously investigated, new funds were being allocated for them, and dozens of states passed stricter regulations and laws for the facilities, nurses, doctors, and inspections.
She opened the door to awareness of what the conditions were. And so that opened that dialogue for people to advocate.
Supported by Nellie Bly's report, new advocates tried to teach and inform the general public about what the mentally ill were experiencing. Two of the major endeavors to educate the public about the importance of mental health were Charlotte Perkins Gilman's book, The Yellow Wallpaper, and the Mental Health Declaration of Human Rights created by the Citizens Commission on Human Rights.
She did take a stand for people with disabilities at that time and was their voice.
Nellie Bly's bold determination to take this inequality and social issue head on and expose it to the public led to changes in state government and major reform on how the mentally ill were seen and treated. Nellie Bly's pioneering stand ultimately helped to create a more just and equal modern world. Social change, as well as change to the treatment of minority groups, takes time, however. Although asylums have disappeared through the process of deinstitutionalization, it has been said that the prison system has taken over where asylums stopped, with mentally ill minorities being incarcerated at an alarming rate. Author and political journalist Heather McDonald has said, "Jails have become society's primary mental institutions. The few have the funding or expertise to carry out the role properly." Perhaps another Nellie Bly will be needed once again to take a stand today.